The dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona, had seen their share of desperate souls, but none quite like Eleanor Whitmore. She stood on the wooden porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, her emerald dress a stark contrast against the weathered planks beneath her feet. The year was 1882, and the frontier town buzzed with the kind of danger that made decent folks lock their doors after sunset. Eleanor wasn't decent folks. Though she'd been born to be, she was a woman with a target on her back and a fortune that men would kill for. The letter in her trembling hands bore the seal she'd come to dread, another threat from the Cassidy gang. They wanted her father's mine, the one that had made the Whitmore name synonymous with silver and success throughout the Arizona Territory. But her father was 6 feet under now, and Eleanor was all that stood between the Cassidys and a fortune worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. "Miss Whitmore?" The voice belonged to a man who seemed to have materialized from the shadows themselves. She turned to find herself face to face with the most intimidating figure she'd ever encountered. Jake Morrison stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling out a worn leather vest that had seen more gunfights than most men saw sunrises. His dark hair fell just past his collar, and his steel-gray eyes held the kind of hardness that came from surviving in a world where weakness meant death. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and we love connecting with our listeners from all corners of the globe. "You're the gunslinger Sheriff Martinez recommended?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. She'd heard stories about Jake Morrison, how he'd cleaned up 3 towns single-handedly, how his drawl was faster than lightning, and how he'd never lost a man he'd been hired to protect. Jake touched the brim of his black hat, a gesture that might have been polite, if not for the way his eyes never stopped scanning the street behind her. "I am, and you're the lady with the Cassidy problem." It wasn't a question. In a town like Tombstone, news traveled faster than bullets, and everyone knew about the threats against the Whitmore heiress. Eleanor nodded, clutching the letter tighter. "They've given me until the end of the week to sign over the deed to the Silver Moon Mine. If I don't—" She didn't need to finish. They both knew what happened to people who crossed the Cassidy gang. "My rate is $50 a week, plus expenses," Jake said, his voice as steady as his gun hand. "I'll need a room near yours, and I go where you go. No exceptions." The price was steep, but Eleanor had expected as much. A man with Jake Morrison's reputation didn't come cheap. "And you can guarantee my safety?" For the first time, something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of Jake's mouth. "Lady, I've been keeping people alive in this territory for 8 years. I haven't lost one yet, and I don't plan to start with you." Eleanor extended her gloved hand, and Jake shook it with a grip that was firm but surprisingly gentle. "Then you're hired, Mr. Morrison. When do we start?" "We already have," Jake replied, his eyes catching movement across the street. 3 men in dusty coats had been watching them for the past 5 minutes, and Jake didn't believe in coincidences. "First lesson, never stand in the open longer than necessary. Let's get you inside." As they moved toward the hotel, Eleanor couldn't help but notice how Jake positioned himself between her and the street, his hand resting casually near his Colt .45. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The next morning brought news that chilled Eleanor to the bone. The Cassidy gang had struck again, this time hitting a supply wagon just outside of town. 2 men were dead, and the message was clear: They were tightening the noose around Tombstone, cutting off Eleanor's escape routes one by one. Jake found her in the hotel dining room, staring at her untouched breakfast while reading the telegram that had arrived with the dawn. "Bad news travels fast in the desert," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. "They're not just after the mine," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They want to make an example of me, show everyone what happens when you don't bend to their will." Jake studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands shook slightly as she folded the telegram. "Tell me about your father's mine. What makes it so special that the Cassidys are willing to wage war over it?" Eleanor's eyes took on a distant look. "Papa discovered the richest silver vein in the territory 3 years ago. The silver moon produces more in a month than most mines do in a year. But it's not just about the money. It's about control. Whoever owns that mine controls the water rights to half the valley. Without water, the other ranches and mines dry up. So it's about power," Jake said, understanding dawning in his gray eyes. "The Cassidys don't just want your mine. They want to own this entire region." Eleanor nodded. "And I'm the only thing standing in their way. Papa made sure the deed was ironclad. It can only be transferred by me and only if I'm alive to sign it." "Which explains why they haven't just killed you outright," Jake mused. "They need you alive, long enough to sign, but scared enough to comply." The sound of spurs on wooden floors made Jake's hand move instinctively to his gun. 3 men entered the dining room, their faces bearing the hard lines of men who lived by violence. Eleanor recognized the leader immediately, Tom Cassidy himself, a man whose reputation for cruelty was legendary throughout the territory. "Miss Whitmore," Cassidy said, removing his hat with mock politeness, "I hear you've hired yourself some protection. That's real smart thinking, considering the dangerous times we're living in." Jake remained seated, but Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Mr. Cassidy," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "I wasn't expecting to see you in town." Cassidy's smile was cold as winter wind. "Oh, I make it my business to check on my neighbors, especially when they're having trouble making important decisions." His eyes shifted to Jake, taking in the worn gun belt and the way the stranger's hand rested near his weapon. "And you must be the famous Jake Morrison." "I've heard stories." "I'm sure you have," Jake replied, his voice carrying a quiet menace that made the other diners suddenly find their meals fascinating. "Well, Mr. Morrison, I hope Miss Whitmore is paying you well. It would be a shame if you got caught up in a family dispute that's none of your concern." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jake stood slowly, his full height making him tower over Cassidy. "Funny thing about my line of work, once I take a job, it becomes my concern, and I take my concerns very seriously." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Finally, Cassidy stepped back, his smile never wavering. "Well then, I suppose we'll be seeing more of each other. Miss Whitmore, you have until Friday. I do hope you'll make the right choice." After the Cassidys left, Eleanor realized she'd been holding her breath. "He's not going to give up," she said. "I'm counting on it," Jake replied, settling back into his chair. Men like Cassidy make mistakes when they get impatient, and impatient men get careless. As the days passed, Jake proved to be more than just a hired gun. He was a strategist, a protector, and surprisingly, a gentleman. He escorted Eleanor to the bank, to the general store, and to her father's lawyer, always maintaining a professional distance, while keeping her safe from the increasingly bold attempts by Cassidy's men to intimidate her. But it was during the quiet moments that Eleanor began to see the man behind the reputation. When he thought she wasn't looking, she caught glimpses of kindness in his steel-gray eyes. He helped an elderly woman with her packages, gave coins to street children, and spoke gently to the hotel's nervous staff. On Wednesday evening, as they sat on the hotel's second-floor balcony, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor found herself studying Jake's profile. "Why do you do this?" she asked suddenly. Jake turned to her, surprised by the question. "Do what?" "This job, putting your life on the line for strangers. Surely there are easier ways to make a living." For a long moment, Jake was quiet, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "I grew up on a ranch about 50 miles north of here," he said finally. "Had a sister, younger than me by 3 years, prettiest girl in the county, with a laugh that could make you forget all your troubles." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more to the story. "When I was 22, a gang of rustlers decided they wanted our land. My father refused to sell, so they came in the night, burned the house, killed my parents, and took my sister." Jake's voice remained steady, but Eleanor could see the pain in his eyes. "I tracked them for 6 months. Found them holed up in a canyon near the Mexican border. What happened? I killed them all," Jake said simply, "but I was too late to save her. She died weeks before I found their camp." He turned to look at Eleanor, and she saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "I swore that day I'd never let another innocent person suffer if I could prevent it. It's not about the money, Miss Whitmore. It's about making sure the wolves don't win." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm sorry. I had no idea." "Most people don't. They see the gun and the reputation and think that's all there is." Jake's voice softened. "But you're different. You see people, really see them. That's rare in this world." Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, something that had nothing to do with their professional arrangement, and everything to do with the growing connection she'd been trying to ignore. Thursday morning brought the news they'd been dreading. The Cassidy gang had taken control of the road leading to the Silver Moon mine, effectively cutting off Eleanor's access to her own property. Worse, they'd started spreading word that anyone who did business with Eleanor Whitmore would face consequences. "They're trying to isolate you," Jake explained as they stood in the sheriff's office, studying a map of the territory. "Cut off your support. Make you feel like you have no choice but to give in." Sheriff Martinez, a weathered man in his 50s, shook his head grimly. "I've got 3 deputies and a town to protect. I can't spare men to escort you to the mine, Miss Whitmore. I'm sorry." Eleanor felt the walls closing in around her. "So what are my options?" "You could leave," Jake said quietly. "Take what money you have and start over somewhere else. California maybe, or back east." The suggestion hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "And let them win? Let them take everything my father worked for?" She shook her head fiercely. "No, I won't run." Jake studied her face, seeing the determination there, the fire that had kept her going despite the threats and intimidation. "Then we make our stand, but we do it smart." "What do you have in mind?" Sheriff Martinez asked. Jake traced a route on the map with his finger. "There's an old mining trail that leads up through Devil's Canyon. It's rough going, but it connects to the backside of the Silver Moon property. If we can get there without being seen, we can access the mine and gather evidence of the Cassidy's illegal activities." "That trail hasn't been used in years," the sheriff protested. "It's dangerous, especially this time of year." More dangerous than facing the Cassidy gang head-on? Jake countered. At least this way, we choose the ground. Eleanor looked between the two men, understanding that this was her moment of truth. When do we leave? We? Jake's eyebrows rose. Miss Whitmore, this isn't a Sunday ride. If something goes wrong up there, then I'll face it, Eleanor interrupted. It's my mine, my fight. I won't hide behind you while you risk your life for my inheritance. Jake saw the steel in her green eyes and realized that arguing would be futile. All right, but we do this my way, no questions asked. Your life depends on following my lead. Eleanor nodded. Agreed. As they prepared to leave, Jake found himself watching Eleanor with new eyes. She wasn't just a client anymore. She was a woman of courage and principle. Someone worth protecting not just for money, but for reasons that had nothing to do with their professional arrangement. The ride through Devil's Canyon tested every skill Jake had learned in his years on the frontier. The trail was treacherous, winding through narrow passages between towering rock walls that seemed to scrape the sky. Eleanor proved to be a capable rider, keeping up despite the difficult terrain and never complaining about the punishing pace. They reached the Silver Moon Mine just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The sight that greeted them made Eleanor gasp in dismay. The mine entrance had been dynamited shut, and Cassidy's men had left their mark everywhere. Broken equipment, scattered papers, and a sign that read Cassidy Property nailed to what remained of her father's office. They've been busy, Jake observed grimly, his hand resting on his gun as he scanned the area for signs of ambush. Eleanor dismounted and walked toward the ruins of her father's dream, her heart breaking with each step. 20 years he worked this claim, 20 years of back-breaking labor, and they destroyed it in a day. Jake followed her, his eyes constantly moving, alert for any sign of danger. The mine can be reopened, equipment can be replaced. What matters is that you're alive to rebuild. Is it worth it? Eleanor asked, turning to face him. All this death and destruction, just for silver and water rights? Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. It's not about the silver, Eleanor. It's about not letting bullies win. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. The use of her first name sent a shiver through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the cooling desert air. Jake, the sound of approaching horses cut off whatever she'd been about to say. Jake's gun was in his hand before Eleanor could blink, and he was pushing her toward the cover of a large boulder. How many? She whispered. 6, maybe 7, Jake replied, his voice calm despite the danger. Cassidy's brought friends. Tom Cassidy's voice echoed off the canyon walls as he and his men rode into the clearing. Well, well, Miss Whitmore and her pet gunslinger. I have to admit, I'm impressed. Not many people would be foolish enough to come up here alone. Jake stepped out from behind the boulder, his gun trained on Cassidy. We're not alone, and we're not leaving without what we came for. Cassidy laughed, a sound devoid of humor. And what exactly did you come for? As you can see, there's nothing left here but rocks and regret. Eleanor emerged from cover, her chin raised defiantly. I came to see what you've done to my property, and to tell you that I'll never sign that deed, no matter what you do to me. Oh, Miss Whitmore, Cassidy said, shaking his head sadly. I was hoping you'd be more reasonable, but I suppose some people have to learn the hard way. The gunfight that followed was swift and brutal. Jake's reputation proved well-earned as his Colt spoke with deadly accuracy, dropping 2 of Cassidy's men before they could clear leather. But they were outnumbered, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before their luck ran out. The mine shaft. He called to Eleanor as bullets whined off the rocks around them. There's a back entrance through the old tunnel. They fought their way toward the partially collapsed entrance, Jake's gun providing cover while Eleanor scrambled over the rubble. Just as they reached safety, Jake felt the burn of a bullet creasing his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him stumbling into the darkness of the tunnel. "Jake!" Eleanor's voice was filled with panic as she caught him, her hands coming away bloody from his wound. "I'm all right," he said through gritted teeth, though the pain in his shoulder suggested otherwise. "Just a scratch." Outside, they could hear Cassidy shouting orders to his men. "Seal them in! If they want to die in that mine, we'll accommodate them." The sound of dynamite being placed near the entrance sent a chill through Eleanor. "They're going to bury us alive." Jake looked around the tunnel, his mind racing despite the pain. "There's another way out. Your father showed me once, years ago, when I was working security for a silver shipment. There's a natural cave system that connects to the main tunnel about a quarter-mile in. You knew my father? I worked for him twice, back when I was just starting out. He was a good man, Eleanor. He'd be proud of how you've handled all this." The explosion that sealed the main entrance sent rocks tumbling around them, but the tunnel held. Jake led Eleanor deeper into the mine. Using matches to light their way through the darkness, his shoulder throbbed with each step, but he pushed forward, driven by the need to keep Eleanor safe. They found the cave system exactly where Jake remembered it, a narrow opening that led upward through the mountain. The climb was treacherous, made worse by Jake's injury, but Eleanor proved to be stronger than either of them had expected. "Why didn't you tell me you knew my father?" she asked, as they rested in a wider section of the cave. Jake was quiet for a moment, his face illuminated by the flickering matchlight. "Because I didn't want you to think I took this job out of obligation. What I feel for you, it has nothing to do with your father or his memory." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "What you feel for me?" Jake met her eyes, and in that moment, all pretense fell away. "I love you, Eleanor. I know it's crazy. We've known each other less than a week, but I've never felt anything like this before. You're brave and kind and beautiful, and somewhere along the way, protecting you stopped being a job and became the most important thing in my world." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks as she reached up to touch his face. "Jake, you don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know I'm just a hired gun, and you're a lady with education and breeding. I just wanted you to know, in case we don't make it out of here." Eleanor silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her feelings into that single moment of connection. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "You're not just a hired gun. You're the man who saved my life, who showed me what real courage looks like. And I love you too, Jake Morrison, with all my heart." They emerged from the cave system just as the sun was setting, painting the desert in brilliant shades of orange and red. Below them, they could see Cassidy and his remaining men riding away, apparently convinced that their enemies were buried beneath tons of rock. "What now?" Eleanor asked as they made their way down the mountainside. Jake winced as he adjusted his makeshift sling. "Now we go back to town and tell Sheriff Martinez what happened. With witnesses to the destruction of your property and the attempt on our lives, he'll have grounds to arrest Cassidy. And after that?" Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. "After that, if you'll have me, I'd like to help you rebuild. The mine, your father's legacy, all of it. I'm tired of wandering, Eleanor. I want to put down roots somewhere, with someone who matters." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in weeks. "I can't think of anything I'd like more." The ride back to Tombstone was slow, hampered by Jake's injury and their exhausted horses, but neither of them minded. They had found something in the darkness of that mine that was worth more than all the silver in the territory. They had found each other. Sheriff Martinez was waiting for them when they arrived, along with a telegram that changed everything. The territorial governor had finally responded to the reports of Cassidy's activities, and federal marshals were already on their way to Tombstone. "Seems your troubles are about to be over, Miss Whitmore," the sheriff said with satisfaction. "The Cassidy gang's reign of terror is coming to an end." Eleanor looked at Jake, seeing the relief in his eyes. "What will you do now?" she asked. "With the Cassidys gone, you won't need to protect me anymore." Jake's smile was soft and full of promise. "I was hoping you might consider hiring me for a different kind of job, something more permanent." "What did you have in mind?" "Well, a mine operation needs security, and a woman like you deserves a husband who will love and protect her for the rest of her days." Eleanor's laughter rang out across the dusty street, a sound of pure joy that made everyone who heard it smile. "Mr. Morrison, I believe you're hired." 6 months later, the Silver Moon Mine was producing again, more profitable than ever under the joint management of Jake and Eleanor Morrison. The Cassidy gang had been captured and brought to justice, and Tombstone had settled into a peaceful prosperity that few frontier towns ever achieved. Eleanor stood on the porch of their new house, built on a hill overlooking the mine, watching her husband ride up the trail after his daily inspection of the property. He still wore his gun, but these days it was more for show than necessity. The territory was changing, becoming civilized, and men like Jake Morrison were helping to build something better than the lawless frontier they'd known. "How was your day, Mr. Morrison?" she called as he dismounted. "Better now that I'm home, Mrs. Morrison," he replied, climbing the steps to sweep her into his arms. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Eleanor reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had hired Jake Morrison to guard her body, but he had ended up guarding her heart as well. And in return, she had given him something he'd never expected to find: a home, a purpose, and a love that would last forever. The frontier was a hard place, full of danger and uncertainty, but it was also a place where two souls could find each other against all odds. Eleanor had learned that sometimes the best protection wasn't a gun or a badge. It was the love of a good man who would stand by you no matter what storms might come. And as Jake held her close, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, he knew that he had finally found what he'd been searching for all his life. Not just someone to protect, but someone to love, someone to build a future with in this wild and beautiful land they now called home.